The sound didn't echo. It shattered. A sharp, furious, "Get out of here!" tore across the marble hall of the Astoria Grand Gallery, slicing the quiet like a blade through silk. Guests froze mid-sip, mid-step, mid-breath. Phones lifted. Eyes widened. Conversations died instantly, collapsing into a single collective gasp. At the center of it all stood a tall black woman in a deep sapphire gown, posture flawless, arms folded calmly across her chest. She didn't flinch when the elderly woman in emerald green stepped forward and pressed a trembling palm against her cheek, as if physically pushing dignity out of the room. The crowd reacted before she did. A woman in a maroon dress clasped a hand to her mouth. A man in a burgundy tuxedo instinctively reached for his phone. The older couple near the statue corridor glared with the sort of entitlement that didn't need volume to be violent. Every camera in the gallery seemed to angle toward the same moment, an accusation disguised as authority, entitlement masked as protocol. The elderly woman leaned in, lips curled. "You don't belong here," she hissed. "Not," Whispered announced. Loud enough for the marble to remember. But the black woman didn't step back, didn't lower her eyes, didn't explain herself. She simply breathed, slow and steady, like someone who'd seen this performance before, 1,000 times in 1,000 rooms that looked exactly like this room's, where legacy clung to the walls and bias hid behind chandeliers. Behind the crowd, someone whispered, "Who is she?" Another voice snapped, "Nobody, just filming for attention." But the tremor in their voices betrayed uncertainty. She didn't look like nobody. Not with that posture. Not with that unsettling calm. The elderly woman raised her voice again, drawing every gaze back to her fury. "Security will remove you. Now." The black woman blinked once. A slow, deliberate, dangerous blink. And then she spoke for the first time. Not loud. Not defensive. Just a controlled exhale wrapped in words. "Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to her." "Dat said, Doc Tolles." Her gaze lifted toward the woman still trembling with rage. "You've said enough." The gallery air thickened, charged, as if every marble statue turned its head toward the brewing storm. Guests leaned in, sensing something they couldn't name but couldn't look away from. Because the woman they tried to humiliate wasn't leaving, and the silence she held wasn't fear. It was warning. The gallery didn't calm after the outburst. It tightened. A ripple moved through the room, sharp as broken glass. People weren't just watching now. They were committing to a narrative they hadn't even verified. The woman in sapphire stood motionless, yet somehow the entire hall seemed to orbit her, some circling with curiosity, others with contempt. The elderly woman in emerald took another step, face flushed with the power of an audience. "Security," she barked to no one in particular, because people like her didn't call staff. They summoned them. A murmur rose behind her. She must have sneaked in. Probably some influencer. Dressed like that, clearly looking for attention. None of them knew her name. All of them felt entitled to judge it. A man in a burgundy tuxedo, clearly family, lifted his phone, thumb already hovering over a contact labeled "Private Tay Staff Line." His jaw was set, like this was routine, like removing people was just another task between cocktails. Behind him, a woman in a gold gown angled her phone closer, recording openly now. "I swear these people will do anything to crash an event," she muttered. Not quietly, not kindly. Still, the black woman didn't react. Her breathing barely moved the fabric across her ribs. Her eyes traveled slowly across the crowd, row by row, gaze by gaze, registering each assumption tossed her way. Not absorbing it, categorizing it, like evidence. Someone near the statues whispered, "Why isn't she saying anything?" Another answered, "Because she knows she's guilty." But one pair of eyes didn't match the rest. A young woman in a maroon dress, phone still in hand, kept glancing between the elderly matriarch and the unmoving CEO. Doubt flickered across her brow. She lowered her camera slightly, lips parting like she might speak. She didn't. Not yet. The elderly woman scoffed dramatically. "I won't have my family's gala contaminated by imposters." Her hand hovered again, an inch from the CEO's face, as if daring her to react, to validate the prejudice hanging thick in the air. The CEO finally shifted one hand, not to block, not to strike back, just to adjust a single earring, slow, deliberate, bored even. A gesture that said, "You don't shake me." It angered the matriarch instantly. "You're ignoring me?" Her voice pitched higher, sharp enough to splinter marble. "You think standing there silently makes you bold? It makes you pathetic." The crowd nodded, mumbled, absorbed her version of reality. But the woman in sapphire simply lowered her hand again and looked past the matriarch as if she could already see the collapse forming behind her. Because something was coming. A shift, a crack, a witness on the edge. And the room had no idea it was seconds away from turning on itself. The crack didn't come from a shout. It came from a tremble. The young woman in the maroon dress, still holding her phone loosely at her side, took one hesitant step forward. Barely a shift, barely a sound, but in a hall where every breath had turned into theater, the movement felt seismic. Her voice wavered. Excuse me." The matriarch spun, emerald silk flashing like a blade. "You stay out of this." Sharp. Instant. Dismissing her the way one swats a fly at a chandelier-lit dinner. But the interruption had already landed. Guests turned toward the young woman, their certainty bending, wobbling. When one person hesitated, suddenly the entire crowd needed reassurance, confirmation. They weren't on the wrong side of something irreversible. The man in the burgundy tuxedo tightened his grip on his phone. "Don't encourage her," he snapped. "She's not supposed to be here." His voice cracked a little, just enough to betray fear. The woman across the hall, gold dress, perfect curls, lowered her recording for half a second. "Are we sure she's no one?" A whisper, but a dangerous one. The matriarch heard it. Her composure wavered. Only for a beat, but it was there, a ripple under the surface of her certainty. She stepped closer to the black woman, almost chest to chest now. "You will leave this gallery before I call every guard in this building," she spat. "And trust me, they listen to my family." Every 30, the CEO finally lifted her eyes to meet hers. Not angrily, not afraid, just steady, like she was measuring the temperature of a storm she'd endured her whole life. Behind them, two guests exchanged uneasy glances. "She's too calm," one murmured. "No one's this calm if they're guilty," the other whispered. Another crack. The young woman in maroon tried again, louder this time. "I think you should check." "Enough." The matriarch's voice exploded, echoing off marble and canvas. Her hand shot out, not to hit this time, but to shove the CEO's shoulder. It barely moved her. The gesture bounced off like an insult thrown at a mountain. A collective inhale swept the hall. Some in shock. Some in excitement. Some realizing the line had finally been crossed. The CEO slowly rolled her shoulder back into place, smoothing the fabric of her gown where the shove had wrinkled it. The simple motion, elegant, dismissive, sovereign, made several people gasp as if she'd just declared war with a breath. The burgundy man muttered, "Just call security already." But he didn't sound convinced. Not anymore. Because the stillness she carried wasn't normal. It wasn't fear. It wasn't submission. It was the kind of quiet a room only feels right before the truth arrives. The kind that says, "You're seconds from the part you'll regret." The gallery felt like it had stopped breathing. Then the young woman in the maroon dress did something no one expected. She lifted her phone again. Not to record. To show something. "Ma'am." Her voice shook, but her courage didn't. I saw her earlier. Her name was on the guest registry." The statement didn't roar through the hall. It slid. Quiet, precise, cutting across the tension like a crack in glass no one could unsee. The man in the burgundy tuxedo stepped forward immediately, panic flickering behind his polished bravado. "That's impossible," he snapped. "Our registry is private. None of the public entries include—" "She wasn't on the public list," the young woman said, firmer now. "She was on the internal one. I recognized the name." A few guests stiffened. "Internal list." The phrase hit like a warning siren. The matriarch whipped around, emerald skirts flaring in indignation. "You're mistaken," she growled. "You have no idea who you're talking about." But the witness didn't back down. For the first time, Her spine straightened. "No," she whispered. "I think I do." The hall buzzed low, unsettled. Some guests stepped closer, curiosity twisting into doubt. Others exchanged nervous glances, suddenly unsure if they wanted to be filmed, standing on the wrong side of history. The CEO remained still, eyes lifted slightly toward the young woman, not thanking her, not rescuing her, just acknowledging her. A silent nod. "You saw the truth." The matriarch slammed her cane against the marble floor. "She is not part of this event. We don't let people like—" The crowd froze. Even she realized she'd gone too far. She swallowed the next word, but swallowing didn't erase it. It sat there in the air, heavy, exposed, undeniable. One of the older guests near the sculpture corridor whispered, "People like, what?" His wife nudged him sharply, but her eyes were already narrowing with suspicion. The maroon-dressed witness inhaled shakily. "She had a black and gold access badge," she said. Only 5 people tonight have that tier, and they're all—" Her gaze shifted to the matriarch's family. Major buyers. A beat. A silence. A fracture. The man in the burgundy tuxedo stepped in front of her quickly, blocking her view, his smile tight enough to crack. "That's enough," he hissed. "You have no idea what you're implying." But the room wasn't listening to him anymore. All eyes drifted slowly, almost magnetically, back to the woman in sapphire. She hadn't moved, hadn't raised her voice, hadn't defended herself. Yet the entire gallery felt like it was tilting in her direction. Because now there was someone willing to say out loud what everyone else had only dared to think. She might not be the intruder here. And the people who claimed to own the room suddenly looked like strangers in it. The fracture finally split open. The matriarch's face twisted, not with fear yet, but with something older, uglier. She stepped so close to the woman in sapphire that the emerald fabric of her gown brushed against the CEO's arm. "You think a badge makes you someone?" she sneered. Her voice cracked like thin ice. "You people always find a way to slip into rooms you don't deserve." The word hung there. Rotting. Stinking. Burning. Guests stiffened. Some inhaled sharply. One woman actually lowered her champagne flute like the drink itself had suddenly gone sour. The young witness whispered, horrified, "Ma'am, you can't say that." But the matriarch was unraveling, threads of entitlement snapping one by one. "Oh, I can say anything I want," she spat. "This is my family's gala, my gallery, my legacy, and women like her." She jabbed a finger toward the CEO's chest. "Don't get to stand here and pretend they belong." For the first time, the CEO blinked. Not in fear, in memory. A flash. 19 years old. Standing outside a ballroom she'd been invited to attend. Wearing her first real dress. A security guard had blocked the doorway with a single arm, eyes cold as stone. "You can't be on this floor," he'd said. "Staff enters from the back." She wasn't staff. She never forgot the choke in her throat, the humiliation sinking like lead in her ribs. The way the chandelier light blurred behind tears she refused to let fall. The presence snapped back like a whip. The matriarch shoved her again, harder this time. A handprint of fury pressed into sapphire silk. That did it. The gallery collectively gasped, noise rising like a wave smashing against rock. Several guests stepped closer out of instinct, unsure whether to intervene or record. The older couple near the statues shook their heads in disbelief. Even the gold-gowned woman lowered her phone, eyes widening. The CEO absorbed the shove the way a monument absorbs rain, untouched at its core. She straightened the fabric over her shoulder, smoothing the crease the matriarch had made. Then she exhaled. Slow, controlled, deadly calm. A calm that felt like the moment right before lightning decides where to strike. The young witness whispered, "They're going too far." The man in the burgundy tuxedo hissed, "Just call security already." But no one moved, because everyone felt it. The shift in pressure, the tightening of the air, the sense that something enormous was about to land. The breaking point had arrived. And the woman they were trying to humiliate wasn't breaking. She was preparing. The room felt skewed now, as if every portrait on the gallery walls was leaning in to watch the moment unfold. The shove should have unbalanced her, should have rattled her, should have proved the matriarch right. But instead, it steadied her. The woman in sapphire finally moved just enough to shift her weight, just enough to let the room know she was done absorbing. Her hand slipped toward the small clasp on her gown, retrieving a slim, dark phone. Not flashy, not jeweled, nothing that screamed wealth, just power concentrated. She lifted it to her ear with the same grace one might use to lift a glass of water. "Alma," she said softly. A few guests frowned. Who was Alma? Why did her voice sound so level? So, official? The line clicked instantly. "I'm here, ma'am." Efficient. Calm. A voice used to handling storms because this wasn't the first one. The matriarch barked, "Put that phone down. You're not calling anyone in my gallery." Now was a visis, but the CEO didn't acknowledge her. She wasn't speaking to the matriarch anymore. She wasn't even speaking to the room. She was speaking as if she was the one who owned it. "Activate Meridian Protocol," she said. "Immediate review." A hush tore through the hall. 3 words, but they hit like a gavel slamming through silk. Alma responded without missing a beat. "Understood. Cross-referencing access logs now. Internal files opening." The man in the burgundy tuxedo blanched. "Internal files? Access logs? What does she mean by protocol?" whispered someone near the marble statue. The matriarch tried to laugh, but it crumbled halfway out of her throat. "Oh, please, you think saying big words makes you important? Security will what?" a guest murmured quietly. No one finished the sentence. The CEO lowered the phone slightly, letting her voice slip into the room like smoke under a door. "You shoved me," she said simply. No anger, just fact. Documented, noted, stored. Alma's voice returned. "Ma'am, I'm forwarding the incident to the acquisitions board. All cameras in the gallery have been synced. Your clearance is fully validated." Clearance. Board. Synced cameras. Eyes widened. Phones dropped a few inches. People who had been filming suddenly regretted knowing their faces might end up on the wrong side of a headline. The matriarch's son hissed, "This can't be happening, mother. Stop talking." Makid goaded. But she couldn't. She was spiraling. "What board?" she snapped. "What clearance? Who do you think you are?" The CEO raised her eyes finally, fully, and the stillness in them was enough to make several guests step back. Not in fear, in recognition. The turn had begun, and the room was starting to understand. They weren't dealing with an intruder. They were dealing with someone who didn't need the matriarch's permission to stand here. Someone who didn't need anyone's permission. Silence bloomed across the gallery. Not the quiet of peace. The quiet of realization. The matriarch opened her mouth to unleash another command, but the CEO spoke first. For the first time, her voice wasn't a whisper, wasn't a murmur, wasn't a careful breath. It was a line drawn in marble. "Alma," she said, eyes still locked on the woman in emerald, "confirm my standing." On the phone, the assistant didn't hesitate. "Yes, ma'am. You hold primary authority over the Meridian acquisition. Full executive clearance, internal buyer designation, level 1. All records match." The gallery inhaled as one. Meridian. Acquisition. Level 1. The room knew those words. Everyone here knew. The Meridian deal was the largest private purchase of the year. Rumored, whispered about, guarded, speculated. A deal valued at over $1 billion. The young witness covered her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. She's the buyer." "Well, Indifix." The man in the burgundy tuxedo stumbled one step back. "No," he muttered. "No, that's not possible." The CEO finally lowered her phone completely. Her posture straightened. Her chin lifted. When she spoke, it wasn't loud, but the words struck like a falling column. "You accused me of crashing a gala in a building I'm in the process of buying." Gasps detonated across the hall. The matriarch froze, every ripple of arrogance draining from her face. Her hand dropped from the air like dead weight. Her eyes flickered wildly between the CEO, the phone, the crowd, searching for a reality where she wasn't the villain in her own gallery. But the room had already made its judgment. The woman in the gold gown stepped back. A man near the sculpture corridor muttered, "That's impossible." Another whispered, "No wonder she was so calm." But the CEO wasn't finished. She took one measured step toward the matriarch, heels clicking softly. A sound somehow louder than her scream had been. You shoved me, she repeated softly. You tried to humiliate me. You tried to remove me. Her eyes sharpened into something diamond-hard. You did all that? To the person funding your family's future? The matriarch's lips parted, but no words came. Not a single one. Because now the gallery understood a terrifying truth. They hadn't insulted a stranger. They had insulted the woman whose signature could decide their legacy. And she hadn't raised her voice. Not once. The reveal didn't need volume. It only needed truth. And the truth had just hit the room like a collapsing chandelier. The collapse didn't arrive with screaming. It arrived with silence. A silence so sharp it felt like the gallery itself had stopped existing for a breath. Then the murmurs began. Soft. Stunned. Deadly. She's the buyer. Oh my God. We picked the wrong side. I knew she looked familiar. Reactions spread through the hall like a fuse catching flame. People lowered their phones. Some turned them off entirely, terrified of being identified as part of the mob that had mocked the woman now revealed as the financial force behind the entire acquisition. The matriarch staggered a half-step backward, fingers trembling as they gripped her emerald shawl. No, this is a mistake, she rasped. You're lying. You must be lying. But even her son, Mr. Burgundy Tuxedo, no longer stood beside her. He backed away slowly, eyes glued to the floor, the reality of their impending downfall crawling up his spine. Mother, he whispered, we should stop. She didn't hear him, or refused to. She jabbed a shaking finger toward the CEO. You think you can walk in here and, her voice cracked painfully, ruin everything my family built? The CEO tilted her head softly, eyes cool as carved obsidian. I didn't ruin it, she said. You did that when you touched me. That it's visible. A ripple of shock swept through the guests. The young witness stepped forward again, voice barely above a whisper. She tried to warn you. The matriarch spun, furious. You stay out. But she froze mid-sentence. Because, for the first time, the crowd stepped away from her. A subtle shift. Bodies angling, shoulders turning, gazes narrowing. She was alone. The CEO didn't move, didn't bask, didn't smirk. Her expression remained almost disappointed, as if she'd witnessed this exact downfall 100 times before. Alma's voice returned through the phone speaker. Ma'am, the board is online. They've reviewed the footage. They request confirmation of your next action. Every head pivoted toward the CEO. Every breath held. Every heartbeat suspended in midair. The matriarch whispered, almost begging now. Please, don't do this. We didn't know who you were. The CEO finally lifted her gaze to meet hers. A calm so pure it terrified everyone in the room. Your mistake, she said, voice a velvet blade, was assuming you needed to know my name, to treat me with dignity. The gallery shattered into silence once more. Not the silence of confusion. The silence of consequences arriving. The gallery no longer felt like a room. It felt like a verdict waiting to drop. The matriarch stood frozen, her emerald gown trembling around her like a collapsing empire. Her son kept whispering, Mom, stop, please stop. But she didn't move, couldn't. The weight of her own actions pinned her to the marble. The CEO took one slow step forward. Not threatening, not looming, just inevitable. Alma, she said softly, eyes still on the woman who had shoved her minutes earlier. Patch them in. The phone clicked. A new voice, deep, composed, unmistakably authoritative, filled the hall. Miss Laurent, the board is assembled. We've reviewed the real-time footage. How would you like to proceed? A collective shiver passed through the gallery. Miss Laurent. Her name, finally spoken. A name people had whispered about in financial circles. A name attached to mergers that reshaped entire sectors. A name capable of deciding the fate of billion-dollar legacies. And she was standing right here, in sapphire, silent until it mattered. The matriarch swallowed hard. I didn't know, she stammered. If I had known who you were, the CEO raised a single hand, stopping her. That's the problem. Her voice didn't rise. It deepened. Respect is not reserved for the powerful. Several guests lowered their eyes. Another voice on the line spoke crisp, unmistakably corporate. Miss Laurent, the acquisition documents can be halted or finalized now. Your direction dictates the outcome. A gasp rippled through the gallery. This was the moment. Everyone felt it. The collapse wasn't an accident anymore. It was a sentence. The matriarch stepped forward weakly. "We can fix this," she whispered. "Please. Our families have worked for decades." The CEO looked at her the way a judge looks at a plea they've already rejected. "Your family's legacy," she said, "shouldn't depend on who you can mistreat without consequences." The room flinched. She turned slightly, giving the entire hall a clear view of her decision as she spoke into the phone. Cancel the acquisition. A single, clean directive. And the billion-dollar future of the family in Emerald evaporated. No dramatics. No shouting. Just power. Real power. Alma confirmed instantly. "Understood, ma'am. The contract is void. Documentation is being circulated." The matriarch collapsed into her son's arms, breath hitching, eyes wide with disbelief. The CEO finally stepped back, folding her arms as calmly as she had when the night began. Around her, the guests did not cheer. They did not whisper. They simply stood in the charged quiet of accountability, because no one had ever seen justice delivered this quietly and cut this deep. For a long moment, no one moved. The billion-dollar collapse settled over the gallery like a sheet of glass, clear, reflective, impossible to ignore. Guests who had once whispered assumptions now found their own reflections, staring back at them, distorted by guilt and dawning clarity. Then the shift began. A woman near the sculpture corridor, one of the first to smirk earlier, quietly lowered her eyes and stepped back, as if trying to melt into the marble. The man in the burgundy tuxedo no longer looked like a man of status. He looked like someone who'd just watched the ground split beneath his family's name. Meanwhile, the young woman in the maroon dress, the witness who had dared to speak, finally stood fully upright. For the first time all night, her shoulders relaxed. She walked forward, slow but steady, until she stood at the CEO's side. I'm sorry they treated you that way," she murmured, voice quivering but honest. The CEO didn't turn to look at her. She didn't need to. The acknowledgement alone carried more grace than anything else in the room. Across the hall, another guest, an older man who had kept quiet at first, cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I should have spoken up. We all should have." His wife nodded solemnly beside him. "This shouldn't have happened," she whispered. A quiet chorus of agreement rippled through the gallery. Not loud, not performative, just real. The matriarch's supporters, once emboldened by shared arrogance, stood scattered now, isolated islands of regret. Their eyes darted around, unsure whether to apologize, flee, or simply hope they weren't noticed. But the CEO noticed everything. Her gaze swept across the hall, not accusatory but painfully clear. "You all saw. You all knew. And you all chose silence." In the corner, a security guard arrived late, summoned long ago by the family's panic. He scanned the tense room, then looked at the CEO, uncertain. The CEO simply shook her head once. A signal, "Stand down." He did. Even security recognized who held the real authority now. Then Alma's voice came through the phone once more, gentle and controlled. "Miss Laurent, all legalities are processed. Do you require anything further?" The CEO finally answered. "No," she said, voice even. "The lesson has been delivered." Her eyes lifted, meeting the stunned crowd one by one. "And next time," she added quietly, "don't wait for a title to treat someone with dignity." Her words didn't fall. They landed. Heavy. Precise. Irrefutable. The aftermath wasn't chaos. It was awakening. The gallery, once a stage for ego and elegance, now felt like a mirror, one that didn't flatter, one that didn't lie. People stood in clusters of uneasy silence, each person replaying the last 10 minutes from the uncomfortable vantage point of hindsight. Their earlier smirks, their whispered judgments, their willingness to believe the worst about the woman in sapphire before she ever spoke a word. This wasn't her reckoning. It was theirs. The matriarch, still trembling in her son's arms, looked decades older now. Not because she'd lost a deal she could recover from that, but because the room had seen who she truly was without her titles, her invitations, her curated legacy. A woman who mistook cruelty for tradition, gatekeeping for dignity, arrogance for authority. Her son finally found his voice. "Mother," he whispered, "you pushed her. In front of everyone. You said those things." She shook her head, choking on denial. I didn't know who she was." "That doesn't make it better," he said. His tone wasn't angry. It was disappointed, far more devastating. Nearby, the gold-gowned woman who had recorded earlier shifted uncomfortably. She tried to hide her phone, but her screen was still glowing, the paused video showing the exact moment the matriarch shoved the CEO. She swallowed hard and lowered it completely, pressing the screen to her chest like a confession. The older couple by the sculpture corridor exchanged a look, one of shame. "We judged her before she'd said a single word," the woman murmured. The man nodded, throat tight. "It wasn't her silence," he said. "It was ours." The young witness in the maroon dress stood closest to the CEO, hands clasped, eyes full of something closer to admiration now. "I should have spoken sooner," she admitted. The CEO finally turned her head a fraction, just enough to meet the young woman's gaze. "You spoke when it mattered," she said softly. That one sentence washed over the witness, like absolution. Across the room, the security guard still standing by the doorway removed his cap respectfully. "Ma'am," he said to the CEO, "if anyone else approaches you disrespectfully tonight, I'll escort them out." The CEO nodded once, acknowledging his effort without glorifying it. Her gaze drifted back to the crowd, sweeping over every face that had watched her be shoved, humiliated, underestimated. And she didn't scold them. She didn't demand apologies. She simply said, "Tonight wasn't about who I am. It was about who you chose to be." The words fell into the hall like a verdict each person would have to carry home, because the real shift wasn't the deal she canceled. It was the reflection she just forced this room to face. The gallery lights seemed to dim around her, not because the bulbs changed, but because every eye in the room had settled on one center point. The woman in sapphire stood there as if carved from the silence itself, a calm pillar rising from the wreckage of arrogance. The matriarch stared at the floor, hands trembling, her empire reduced to a lesson witnessed by dozens. Her son couldn't even meet the CEO's gaze. He held his mother's arm gently, the way one stabilizes a monument that has begun to crumble. Guests no longer whispered. They listened. The shift wasn't dramatic or noisy. It was reverent. A single truth hung in the air. Power had never belonged to the loudest voice. It belonged to the quietest certainty. The CEO let the silence ripen before breaking it. "I didn't cancel the deal because of the shove," she said, voice low but resonant. "I canceled it because of the belief behind it." "What did?" The words moved through the room like a cold current. "You saw me walk in. You saw how I was treated. And most of you," her gaze passed over the bowed heads, "did nothing." Some guests winced. "Not from accusation, but recognition," she continued, steady as marble. "Titles don't make you decent. Money doesn't make you worthy. And tradition doesn't excuse cruelty. House." Her eyes lifted toward the grand chandelier, the one the family had bragged about all night, the one that symbolized their lineage. "Legacy means nothing," she said, "if dignity isn't part of it." The young witness in maroon swallowed hard, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She wasn't the only one. A few guests subtly wiped their faces, confronted by a truth they didn't want but desperately needed. And to those who stood silent, the CEO added, "Remember this." She stepped forward, each click of her heel a soft hammer striking the gallery floor. "Next time, you won't be judged by the person with the most power in the room." Her voice sharpened, a velvet blade. "You'll be judged by the person with the least." A hush rippled outward, heavy and cleansing. Then she gave them the final line, the one the room would carry long after the chandelier dimmed and the cameras stopped recording. "I didn't raise my voice tonight. I raised the standard." No applause followed. No one dared. They simply watched her walk away, not as the woman they underestimated, but as the woman who had redefined the room. And the echo she left behind wasn't sound. It was truth.